Hello, denizens of YouTube. It is I, Nick Dorn, aka Danger Hawkins, and I'm going to talk about two very important things that you need to know if you're a new player and you just started out in trading card games in general. This isn't just for Magic the Gathering people, but if you play like Pokemon the trading card game or Yu-Gi-Oh, any of those, these are generally two very important concepts. One more so than the other, because the other one doesn't show up in Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh! I don't think anyway. I don't play either of those anymore, so maybe they changed it. But these two concepts are mana curve, which is more applicable to Magic the Gathering than either of the other two trading card games that I mentioned, and card advantage, which applies to every trading card game. So I'm going to start with card advantage, actually. And basically, the concept of card advantage is very important when you're building a deck, because the idea of card advantage is that you will always have more cards in access to more cards than your opponent does. When I say card advantage, that is what I'm talking about. And basically, gaining card advantage means that you have more cards, that you have access to a larger pool of cards than your opponent does. So if they let's say for example I played Mind Rot, which discards 3 cards from your opponent's hand, and you play that, your opponent, and let's say you both start with a standard hand of 7. Your opponent now has 4 cards. You still have 7, so you have card advantage in this situation. It has given you card advantage, and that's why there are lots of cards that some of the most important cards in Magic are cards that give you draw effects. So cards like Divination is one of the big ones now because it's been reprinted in M14, and it's been reprinted again in Born of the Gods. So it's going to be in Standard for a very long time. So that's one of the big ones now. But basically, the idea of card advantage, like I said, is just you have more cards in your hand than your opponent does, essentially. Now, another thing that I want to talk about is card efficiency. Card efficiency is kind of a subset of card advantage, but card efficiency is more to do with the board than with the hand. So the board is the cards you have on the table. And cards like Doomblade, which is a 2-drop mana card, which is very cheap. You can drop that turn 2 if you hit your mana drop, and it doesn't have any special. It's not like it requires blue mana and black mana. It just requires 1 black mana and then 1 of any other color. So you could drop this turn 2 in just about any deck, pretty much. That has black mana in it anyway. And it destroys target non-black creature, which is very, very good, because as long as you're facing a non-black deck, Doomblade will get rid of bombs and just a lot of other things. And since it was reprinted in the M14 set, it's going to be in Standard until August. So, unless they reprint it again in M15, which would be amazing, and it would definitely be worth looking into. So we're going to talk about card advantage a little bit more. I'm going to use my mill deck as an example for this, because my mill decks, more than a lot of other decks, require you to be good at card advantage. You have to have a good grasp of card advantage in order to work these, and card efficiency for that matter, because your mill decks generally have to run as efficiently as possible. If they don't, then you're in trouble. Now, this deck doesn't have a lot in the way of draw, which is strange for most blue decks in general, because blue decks in general have tons of draw. But I have a couple of these, which are Diabolic Tutors. And you search your library for a card and then put that card into your hand and then shuffle your library. So it's good for what I do, which is with what this deck does, which is combos. And I run 2 or 3 of them. I can't remember if it's 2 or 3. But in terms of efficiency, I have something else. Actually, a couple of something else's that work very well in terms of efficiency, which is Psychic Strike, which is great for mill decks because it's a 3-drop counter spell. And you counter the target spell, its controller puts the top 2 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So it goes towards your win condition, and it deprives your opponent of 2 cards, that's why I like mill. And a lot of people especially in today's metagame, mill actually is not terribly viable. Or normally I would say mill isn't viable. However, now that Fennec's God of Deceit has come out, mill has become much more viable. So there's that. And actually, when I eventually get around to building a commander deck, I'm definitely using Fennec's, because I'm making a mill commander deck, because that is just one of the most ridiculous things ever. But I'm going to get into commander decks in a different video, because this is just how to build a standard deck. So, card advantage, very simple. Draw cards are very important for card advantage. Getting cards that allow you to draw more cards than just a standard card. However, the other way you can keep card advantage is by sticking to a mana curve. Mana curve is very important. And you'll see this whenever you use a deck creator program now. Any deck creation program worth its salt will show you your mana curve, because it's very important now. It used to not be. When the game started out, nobody knew about card advantage. Nobody knew about mana curve. Those were new concepts when they came out. And those concepts help get into top 8s in tournaments and actually win tournaments in a couple of cases. So, card advantage, mana curve, very important. But what I mean by mana curve, you see the mana cost up in the corner of some of these cards. So you see there's a 2-drop right there. Now, a mana curve basically is what your deck will look like in terms of the actual, like, when your deck curves out. That's generally what, when someone talks about mana curve, they're talking about the mana costs of all your cards. So you'll have, like, when you see a mana curve for when you're on, like, mtgdeckbuilder.net, I think it's .net. It's either that or it's .com. I'll look it up and post a link in the subscription. Anyway, MTG Deck Builder, basically, it'll show your curve. So, like, I'll move my hand way back. Or actually, I'll use this handy little stylus. So basically, let's say, for example, you're an aggro deck, like you're super aggro, like you're ultra aggro. You just want to kill the person in 5 turns with just an army of little tiny goblins. Then, like a Boros deck, basically it would go like this. Here's your mana curve. Then it goes from 1 to, like, we'll say 10, because that's like the highest mana cost I've seen in a long time. So let's say 1 to 10. Actually, I think that's the highest mana cost of anything I've seen in Theros is 10. So we'll say 1 to 10. So here's 1 to 10. This is what your mana curve is going to look like. So this is from like 0 to like however many you have. You're gonna have lots of low cost, and you're not gonna have any high cost. If you do, it's gonna be like a couple that are kind of like, oh, hopefully I'll be able to hang on. Because if you're playing a deck, super aggro deck like that, you don't want to be in the late game. You don't even want to get to like 5 mana. You want to beat your opponent long before they get to 5 mana, because otherwise they're usually bringing out their best, and then your tiny little creature army isn't gonna save you at that point. Probably. I mean, I could be wrong. It depends on the deck and the person you're playing against and how experienced they are and how experienced you are and sideboards and complicated stuff like that. So then if you're building like a mid-range deck where you're just trying to do a standard win condition, but you're just, so it would look probably more like it would be more like this, kind of like a hill curve. A bell curve would be what that would look like. You can have a reverse bell curve, which is you have tons of low-cost stuff that barely keeps you alive until you get to your high-cost stuff. There are decks that do that, but those are usually stompy decks. Or, those are land ramp decks, which are not super aggro, but they run fast, or they're supposed to anyway. So land ramp decks are kind of a weird outlier in terms of that. And then you've got like your control decks. Control decks are kind of usually on a bell curve. Then you've got a lot of late game decks usually are going to look something like this. Though this, honestly, this type of mana curve, you won't see this very often. It'll be more like this. You get your mid-range, like your 3-drop, and then it kind of evens off a little bit, or it'll dip down a little bit. But usually you won't see a straight curve you won't see a curve that goes up like that. You will see this, but not this usually. So that's how mana curve generally is. It's very important that you understand how mana curve works, because that's one of the key concepts that I will be going over in my deck building video. which I'm probably going to make right after this one and post right after this one. I just wanted to get these two concepts out there. You don't have to understand them completely because it does take a while to understand them completely. And when you're like understanding efficiency of cards again, you're basically what you're really looking for in your cards is, especially in like destruction. If you can get like for a cheap card, like a 1-for-1 is very important. And you're gonna be looking at mana costs too. Gonna be like you gotta look at what you're getting for your mana. You can't just take like a grizzly. You can't just take a bear, which is a creature that's a 2/2 for 2. It's a 2 toughness, 2 power, vanilla creature, which means it has no abilities. It's just 2/2 for 2. Which is solid in like limited format, but in constructed avoid those because, and I'll get into I guess I'll get into it a little bit now, the difference between limited and constructed. Limited is like when you're doing a booster draft or something like that, where you're doing a booster draft or a sealed deck draft, that kind of thing. You're doing sealed events where you're drafting. Or cube draft. Because you're at that point you're trying to that runs way differently than constructed, which is what I play. I have literally never done any draft except online, and I've never done. I don't do Magic the Gathering online, so I've never done drafts on that. So I've drafted against mainly AI opponents. So I'm building a cube, but that's for a different video. I'm not even going to get into cubes right now because that is just like that might even be a series of videos that I'm going to talk about cubes. But in constructed, that's like most standard tournament format, vintage tournament format, which actually vintage is now, vintage doesn't exist anymore. Legacy exists. Legacy is everything. That's like every card. Standard is only the cards in the newest sets and the current core set, which is M14, and then Theros, Born of the Gods, and the Return to Ravnica, as all normal people say it, set. So that's basically how standard is. And then you have modern, which is from 8th edition and up, which is, I could do modern as well. Because legacy, you can basically, if you're just starting out, you probably could play any of those formats. Though mind you, if you tried to bring a standard deck into legacy, you'd have trouble. Same with modern, because they have a lot more cards, a lot wider card pool. So a deck that's good in standard is, depending on the standard format and depending on the metagame, probably isn't going to do as well in legacy and modern. I'll get into the formats in a different video, but that's just a quick overview so that you understand what I'm talking about when I say I'm honestly talking about casual, which is just, it doesn't matter what you put in your deck. As long as it follows the 4 of any copy except basic lands and relentless rats. Yeah, so that's card advantage and mana curve in their most basic terms. If you didn't understand, please comment and tell me that you didn't understand so that I can either A, release another video that will explain it better or give you links that explain it much better than I did. But like I said, this is just kind of like a companion video for my deck building video. So if you made it to this point in watching the video, then you might just want to stop now and go watch my deck building video. And with that final statement, peace out, subscribe,